You mentioned earlier when you were talking about the benefits of spirituality, no, the benefits of Tai Chi having benefits within the spiritual and transcendental realm. What does that mean? Because you said you would touch on it. I'm curious.
Yeah, so I think one of the weirdest things, so let me ask, so do we have scientific existence of the proof of thought? Or scientific proof of the existence of thought, sorry.
I mean, that's so abstract that I guess you can answer it both ways, I guess. Yes and
What
no.
would you say?
I would say yes.
How so?
Because you can speak to a human, you can give them commands, they can follow them. And
So, but
to
that's-
me, cognition is thought
Yeah, so, but how do we know that cognition exists?
because we can test it
How can we test it?
by asking someone a question, by giving them a command and seeing an outcome.
Right, but so then what are we actually measuring? We're measuring words and actions. We can't detect a thought. So for all you know, so like, am I thinking right now?
Like to me, the definition of a thought is a signal.
So you have an experience of thoughts, right?
Correct.
But we don't have, so we can do EEG, we can do fMRI, but this measures electrical activity, it measures blood flow to the brain. We can observe the impact of thought, but we actually have no, and maybe someone will prove me wrong. I've been asking this to a lot of neuroscientists and psychiatrists. We don't have any proof of the existence of thought. So we just can't measure thoughts, right? So I can't detect thoughts. I can't verify for you that thoughts exist. We have a lot of implications that are based on thought. How do
We have a strong, like for example, we don't have randomized controlled studies that smoking is really problematic, but we have such strength in correlational data that we don't need the randomized controlled data.
Sure.
Same that I feel about thoughts.
Yeah,
There's
so-
enough correlational data that thoughts exist that I'm sufficient with.
I completely agree, but we have no proof. It was sufficient evidence, fine, for the faith of it, but we have no proof that thoughts actually exist. They have no material form. We don't know if they may have a correlation with electrical activity. We know we can stimulate certain parts of the brain to trigger some kinds of thoughts. That's how we know which parts of the brain do what. Because we ask people, what are you thinking when your amygdala is active? Oh, that's where anxiety or fear comes from.
Or injuries in those areas leading to deficits.
Absolutely, right? So if we have bilateral amygdalar lesions, people have the stress-freest life on the planet. It's amazing. So if we kind of look at it, there's a whole dimension to existence, and this is where I go off the rails. There's a dimension to existence, which is kind of this dimension of thought and other things, which we actually don't, or not scientifically, there's no material to it. There's an energetic correlation, sure, there's tissue activation, sure, but that's biology. That's not actually the subjective experience of thought. So if you look at a lot of the way these spiritual techniques were developed, they weren't looking at the biology, and that's why they didn't develop instrumentation. They were looking at this subjective realm of experience. And in that subjective realm of experience, if you explore that and refine your mind and other parts of you, you are capable of experiencing things that will have all kinds of different effects. So you can gain knowledge. So this is sort of like the concept of like intuition, right? Which we also have some degree of access to. But what are the practices which hone your intuition, let's say? And then that's on the more believable or scientific
Like visualization, et cetera.
Yeah. So there's visualization that maybe does something, and we have some of those mechanisms. We have intuition, which is different from like logical thinking. But then as you experience particular things in meditation, these are what I would call transcendent experiences because they're not of the mind. So they're not a thought or an emotion, but they are like a raw experience. And this can be transformative, and depending on what you believe or what your experience is, you can even like work on some weird manifestation. Now we're getting into Deepak Chopra realm, which I think some of that is legitimate, by the way. And then like you can start to affect change. So just as a simple example, I think a big thing that is responsible for my trajectory, which is a statistical variant probability. So what's the likelihood of getting into medical school with like a 2.5 GPA? My MCAT score was pretty good. So there's still like a chance. I was like a 1 in 10,000. I looked at the AMC publishes that data. So I looked at it. So I'm like a 1 in 10,000 chance. And so there's just a lot of things that are statistical improbabilities.
I mean, the fact that the sperm chose the egg is already the most wildest.
Statistical,
Yeah.
Right? So for me, though, I started a spiritual practice, which my teacher, my guru, told me, like, if you do this, he said, do you want a spiritual practice that will help you in the material world or help you in the spiritual world? And I said, can I have one that does both? And he's like, absolutely, we can do that for you. So I think I really do believe that a lot of my success comes from the utilization of a mantra that harnesses this weird transcendental energy stuff. Now, when you come to science, we have some mechanisms of this, and it may not be so crazy. So we know, for example, that if you look at the healing power of psychedelics, first thing to understand is that psychedelics activate circuitry that exists in the brain, right? So psychedelic can't make something new. All we can do is activate receptors in a potentially non-endogenous way, but the circuitry's there, which also means that there are ways to theoretically activate it through practices like meditation, which is, I think, basically what goes on. Mm-hmm. And then we also know from science or from studies that deactivation of the default mode network correlates with like a sense of wellness. We can also predict what kind of trip you have and whether that will be healing for mental health concerns. So if you have a trip where you're just flying around, that doesn't actually lead to, or doesn't appear to lead to mental health improvement. If you have a trip where you have a sense of ego death, that's what correlates with mental health improvement. And so then we have some of these transcendental practices which dissolve your sense of identity. So like you have this sense of this is who I am. And with that comes all kinds of problems, because now if you're a person, I'm tall, I'm short, I'm this, I'm that. There's a bunch of spiritual practices that are designed to dissolve the ego. And in that process, once you dissolve your sense of self, then you get access to transcendental states. So some of this stuff we know is scientifically correct. Some of this stuff we have some scientific theory of mechanism, like default mode network, psychedelics, ego death, and meditation. And then even beyond that, though, the transcendental stuff, we have no idea what's going on there.
What is going on a practical level? Like maybe not on a measurable level, but how would you describe it to me?
So I would describe it to you as the basic unit of existence is consciousness. And consciousness coalesces into energy, and energy coalesces into matter. So we can affect things in the material world by working on the level of matter, or we can access the consciousness level, which will then dribble down into manifestation in the real world. Mm-hmm. And I'll be the first to admit that that makes no scientific sense.
I think it does. Why not? It's the same way that, when people incorrectly
this coming from you, Mike?
What? Wait, no, why?
I just expected the staunchest.
That's the thing. That's why you think I'm a disbeliever, but I'm not. I think also you have to remember I'm not an allopathic physician.
Oh, that's your deal.
I'm an osteopathic physician. So that there's value here that's unmeasurable to some degree with our current tools. And that's why I don't always throw out the baby with the bathwater. It's the worst example, the worst saying ever. But when we incorrectly say depression is a disease of chemicals in your brain, right? That's not really what's going on. And our serotonin hypothesis has been disproven, all this stuff. And some people say, well, you have to take medications for it because you have a chemical issue. And if you take the medicine, it would change your neurochemistry and et cetera, et cetera. When you meditate, when you go through CBT, when you take certain actions in your life, those aren't medications, and yet it changes your neurobiology. Why is it unreasonable to say that when you experience this higher state of consciousness, you're not also impacting your neurobiology?
Oh, you absolutely are. So I think the only thing that is unreasonable is, and I'll be the first to say this, and apologies if I misjudged you. The only thing that I think is unreasonable is positing the existence of consciousness. But
these are just terms, and I hate that about science.
What do you mean?
We get caught up on the nomenclature of things instead of talking about what's actually going on. Like two people can talk about the same thing and they'll argue about the word for 3 hours. It's like, who cares that it's called consciousness? Well, there's clearly something going on, whatever we call it. It's clearly having some impact. We can't yet measure it, but there's something happening and we're observing it.
Yeah. So I'm with you there. Like 100%. So I think just in my experiences of higher states of consciousness, and like that's hard to describe, but like we can sort of say that, when you're asleep, there's a lack of awareness. When you're dreaming, there's a lower level of awareness, although there's mental activity. when you're consciously awake, there's also variations in the degree of consciousness and mental activity. When we see things like thought fusion, when someone is having a panic attack, their thoughts are forming their reality.
Yep.
So if you literally look at, I have a video that I made about this, so if you look at the states of consciousness, the more you think that your thoughts are real, the more mentally ill you will be. So if you look at someone who is in psychosis, their thoughts and the reality are one and the same. If you look at someone who has a panic attack, this isn't quite psychosis, but their thoughts are so likely to be true that they feel real. And then you have generalized anxiety disorder. Then you have your breakup, where even in a breakup, if you have no mental illness, you will think, I will be alone for the rest of my life, right? And then what happens is we start to detach from our mind. We become more and more, we change our level of consciousness. So then you have everyday thought where your thoughts are kind of real. Then you have things like the flow state where you lose track of time. Your mind is completely absorbed in one thing and it's a different level of flow. And then even beyond flow, you have a no mind state. So flow is a one-pointed mind state. And so the more that we separate our awareness from our thoughts, the higher we go on the consciousness realm. And then there are even practices to go beyond flow. That's usually what we call a meditative state of dhyan. And then even beyond that is samadhi, which is temporary enlightenment. And these are these blissful or ecstasy kind of states where you also start to like see weird things and stuff like that.
Got it. Okay. Well, I thought that was an awesome conversation.
Thanks
you for
a lot, man.
enlightening me because I think there's a lot of learning opportunities here for us.
It was awesome, Mike. Thank you so much.